In this video lecture, I'm going to go over general theory of drama. And so that's going to be theory of Chekhov's gun. It's going to be flat or two-dimensional characters versus round or three-dimensional characters, static versus dynamic, mise-en-scene, all that kind of stuff. Theory of Chekhov's gun, as I said. So lots of things. But I'm going to do it within the context of talking about Trifles, that small play that everybody in the class has to read. And just as a quick reminder, you are not allowed to write on for this essay assignment. So nobody gets to write on Trifles because we're going to pick it apart. Like in this discussion, I'm going to tell you just about everything that you need to know about it as a way to illustrate how to talk about character, how to talk about identity issues and things like that, how to talk about how the play itself is structured, symbolic props or things like that. Okay. So in this play, we have basically 5 central characters plus 2 that are not ever mentioned or not ever seen on stage, but are mentioned: John Wright and Minnie Foster, Mrs. Wright, the victim and the alleged murderer. Did Mrs. Wright do it? Right? That's really what this play is all about. And so the sheriff's wife, Mrs. Peters, and Hale's wife, Mrs. Hale, are the female perspective in this play. And then you have the sheriff, Mr. Hale, and then the county attorney, who's a younger guy, but it's still very masculinist. And remember, this play is over 100 years old, from 1916. And so this is like pre-women had the right to vote. So this is a very gendered context, right? The power structure is male here, female down here. It's women in the domestic sphere of the home versus men who are outside of that. You see that, for example, in the names. So think about how the characters are named. It's Hale and Mrs. Hale. So she's only known basically as Hale's wife. And there's the sheriff, and then she's even described as, I'm looking at the play here, the sheriff's wife, right? Mrs. Peters. So she's either Mrs. Peters, right, for Sheriff Peters, or the sheriff's wife. Nothing else about them, right? We don't get them as first names. We don't understand them as anything other than related to their husbands, right? Mrs. Wright, for the longest time, goes largely unnamed other than as Mrs. Wright. But then they talk at one point about her being Minnie Foster back before she got married and who she was. Dramatically different woman, energetic and bright and outgoing and happy, and a beautiful singer with the choir in town, and the whole town just thought she was amazing. And then she got married to Mr. Wright, by the way. Yes, it's with a W, but the joke is a little bit there. Mr. Wright, who was not. Okay. So as we go through the play, what we have are 3 male characters walking around this house, the domestic sphere, Mrs. Wright's sphere, and we have 2 women, right? Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. And they see things very differently, even when they're looking at the same stuff. For example, when the men are looking in the kitchen, they deduce that Mrs. Wright is a bad homemaker, right? That she is sloppy, slovenly. We get dirty dishes, the preserves have gone bad, among other things. And they just see it as, man, she wasn't really much, not really doing her wifely duties, quote unquote. But that's not how Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters see it. For them, what they see is a troubled woman. They look at her preserves, right? Jarred fruit and veggies and whatever, and say, okay, those went bad. She would not have let that happen. The only reason she would have let that happen is if something was terribly wrong. Okay. And later, when they get to the knitting, quilting, it's the same thing. The men don't even really notice it because that's women's stuff. It's just a women's hobby kind of thing. But the women look at it and see that towards the end, the quality of the work was getting worse and worse and worse. The sign of a distracted Minnie Foster, Mrs. Wright, that she was troubled, she was in turmoil or chaos, couldn't concentrate, right? So another sign of her intellectual or emotional struggle, or deterioration. So again, these men are looking around and seeing these things that they think are just sloppiness, and the women see much more there. The women see the knitting, which men might be dismissive of and don't even really pay attention to, and they see all this nuance. Okay. And that goes back to the play's title, Trifles. What is a trifle? Yes, it's this like layered dessert thing, but that's not what we're talking about. What it is here is the same as sort of the root word for trivial, right? Inconsequential things. So the men walk around and are constantly seeing what they see as trifles, inconsequential things. But for the women, they mean everything, right? Absolutely everything. It's massive what they have in terms of the meaning or the import. As a result of that, the men miss everything, the women see everything. Okay. Now, the theory of Chekhov's gun, just to sidestep here for a moment, the theory of Chekhov's gun, this is a theory that Anton Chekhov was a short story writer and Russian playwright. And he supposedly said, if there is on the back wall of the stage, if there's a gun, like a big shotgun over a fireplace, let's say, at some point over the 2 or 3 acts of the play, it needs to be used. Now, the question is, how is it going to be used? It could be used literally as a gun where it shoots and kills someone or something. Okay. It could be used in a threatening manner where the person pulls it off and is aiming it at somebody on stage to threaten violence, but it never actually pulls the trigger. It could be where it is a symbol of the man of the house, right? He's got his shotgun above the fireplace. So he walks over to the fireplace and puts his arm up to it. And right here is the shotgun or whatever. And it implies destructive, violent masculinity onto that character. So it has symbolic value there. It also might be where it's associated with a male character and somebody else at some point takes that gun off the mantle and opens the breech, takes out the shells. And so that gun is no longer dangerous, symbolically suggesting that man is no longer dangerous. He's been somewhat emasculated. His ability to threaten or whatever is gone. So that's the idea behind Chekhov's gun, theory of Chekhov's gun, is if there is a prop, if there is a thing built into the play that is mentioned within the script of the play and is on stage, it has importance. It has to be used in some way to reveal character. Otherwise, why is it there, right? Everything is deliberate. And so when we think of, as an example, in Trifles, the jars of preserves that have gone bad, the dirty dishes, the knitting, quilting stuff that is sloppily done towards the end of it, those have symbolic value. Those are not just things that are mentioned. There's value to them that we need to try to decipher. Okay. And I haven't gotten to the most important one, which those of you that read the play, Trifles, know what I'm talking about, which is the bird, more specifically the dead bird, this bird that was singing, or was a singing bird, like a canary, I'm assuming. And it is dead, had its neck broken. And the women discover it, right? And to them, it is incredibly revealing. Okay. And so let's talk about the symbolic value of that bird. Okay. So we have this bird that loved to sing, and it's in this cage. What else loves to sing in this play that we know of? Mrs. Wright, right? When she was Minnie Foster. But what did Mr. Wright do? He stopped letting her go into town to be part of the choir, right? So he took away her ability to sing. She's that bird in the cage who's had her singing taken from her. Okay. The assumption, which is a fair assumption, is that Mr. Wright killed the bird. Some students often think actually it was Mrs. Wright because she couldn't stand the idea of the bird singing if she couldn't. That's a legit interpretation. But more often than not, because of the way the women at the end take the bird and hide it, the readers sort of jump to the conclusion, shall we say, that they see that as incriminating evidence of motivation for Mrs. Wright's act of violence against her husband. Sort of the last straw, right? He had confined her to the home essentially for a very long time, taken her away from her friends, her community, her love of singing. he had stripped away all the things that brought her joy and had basically turned her into a homemaker, and nothing more, right? No kids, just that kind of thing. By the way, this is all based on a true story. It's fascinating. Go read it. Go check it out. Um, so we have this dead bird, symbolic of the singing taken away from our alleged murderer, Mrs. Wright, and implicitly that made her snap. And so she's like, "You break my bird's neck, I'm gonna go after yours." And right, she ends up hanging him. Um, the women deduce all of this. They hide the bird, and in that moment, and this goes back to the names we were talking about earlier, right? Sheriff Hale, or Sheriff Peters, Mrs. Peters, Hale, Mrs. Hale, where they were only seen as women, wives. And in this moment, they stop being the wives of the sheriff or of Mr. Hale, and they go back to being Minnie Foster's friend. Right? And they take that bird and hide it to protect her. The men miss all of the important stuff, these trifles. The women see all of it, and they determine that she probably did it, and they feel like both they failed her and Mr. Wright did her wrong to the point where she snapped. And they are deeply sympathetic to her, and they ultimately decide she gets to go free. Okay. Now, here's where things are a little bit interesting. Susan Glassball also wrote a short story, not a play, on this. So she wrote Trifles as the play, and then she wrote a short story called A Jury of Her Peers. And the whole idea is one is supposedly with the 12 juror system, you are going to be judged by a jury of your peers, whether you are innocent or guilty. And so who are Mrs. Wright's peers? Mrs. Peters, Mrs. Hale, and a jury of her peers found her, for lack of a better word, not guilty. Okay. So three-dimensional versus two-dimensional, round versus flat characters. The idea there is, do they feel authentic? Do they feel real? Okay. Do they feel like a stock character, like in, some generic romantic comedy film? You'll have the stock best friend of the male protagonist of the movie is not quite as attractive and a lot funnier. So he's, glasses, whatever. He's Seth Rogen. He's Lil Ray and Get Out, right? That kind of thing. The female will also have a sidekick, usually not quite as attractive, and usually a little bit smarter, maybe. Like she's going to be the bookish one, whereas the guy's best friend is more likely to be sort of a slob or whatever. Those are sort of stock two-dimensional characters. They don't change over the course of the play, so they're largely static rather than dynamic. Static means they don't change. Dynamic, they change over the course of the play. And they don't feel necessarily like truly authentic, unique individuals. They're just sort of that character. In this one, the men, more than the women, feel like just sort of stock characters. Okay. The women, through their inner dialogue between the two of them, how they struggle back and forth and come to realize that they contributed to Minnie Foster's ostracization, right? They didn't really reach out to her, things like that. They change over the course of the play. They go from being their husband's wives to Minnie Foster's friend again. So there's a dynamic change, right? And they certainly feel more real than the men, right? And so the men feel a little bit more two-dimensional stock, sort of male chauvinist, generic, and the women feel a little bit more real and a little bit more authentic. So therefore a little bit more three-dimensional. Okay. So that's some of that terminology we're talking about. Okay. So what does all this come down to? This play has mise en scene, right? Stuff in the scene. Mise is spelled M-I-S-C, sort of a French way of saying miscellaneous crap in the scene. That's the preserves, the dirty dishes, the quilt knitting, whatever, and the bird in the cage. Okay. So objects, pay attention to those. Theory of Chekhov's gun. Those objects have value. They are trying to express something about the story, about the theme, about the characters, right? So pay attention to those kinds of things in the plays that you're analyzing or the screenplay. And then when it comes to understanding the overall message in this play, we take all these little pieces, and ultimately, Susan Glassbill is pushing the idea that men and women are at odds. They see the world very differently, right? The men couldn't see that Mr. Right was a bad husband because he provided for her. He gave her a home, he gave her food and shelter and the basics. But what the women see is he didn't give her stuff to sustain her spirit or her soul, right? She was denied the things that she needed in terms of beauty and love and community and friendship. Those things were taken from her. And the men don't seem to value that for women. As a result, Mr. Wright died, right, was killed, because what he did not value, Mrs. Wright valued above everything else. Okay. Now, connecting this to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If we think of Minnie Foster, okay, so Minnie Foster, before she was married, had community, she had friendships, she had respect of her peers because everybody thought she was an amazing singer. She had artistic, musical output, so she had that aesthetic need. Think of Maslow's the modified or the revised and expanded Maslow's hierarchy. So she had all of these things, and her husband was slowly stripping them away. He took away her singing, so her aesthetic needs were no longer met, and he took her out of the community. So because she's no longer singing and she's no longer in the community getting that respect, that positive affirmation, right, about her singing, so now esteem needs have been taken away, and then she loses friendship. So now she's in kind of a loveless marriage, at least you can deduce that, and the result is she lost aesthetic, esteem, belongingness, and love. He basically said, I'm giving you biological safety needs, right? I'm giving you food, water, shelter, the basics, security, all that kind of stuff. I'm not giving you anything else. She wanted so much more, and she had so much more that had been stripped away from her. It was a catastrophic loss. She snapped and she killed him. Okay, so that's where Maslow's hierarchy can be pretty useful to think about character motivation and what they want. The men basically say, what does this woman want? He provided her with food, shelter, safety, security, whatever. They don't seem to value esteem, friendship, aesthetic needs, community, those kinds of things. They don't seem to value them for women. So the result was what the men saw as trifling needs, the women see as incredibly valuable. So that disparity in view leads to disparity in interpretation. Okay. All right. I'm going to wrap this up here before I ramble too much. Too late. But I'm hoping this is helpful, how you can pick apart a play, think about the theme, think about character names and Chekhov's gun, that idea, and all this stuff to really come to a broad understanding of what the author is trying to convey, what the playwright is trying to convey in either the play or the screenplay. All right. Consult the Maslow handouts and the Freytag pyramid handouts. By the way, Freytag's pyramid for this, what's the climactic moment? When they are trying to decide what to do with the bird, right? That's the moment, the pivot point for this, where things have two very different outcomes. They ultimately choose to go with, for lack of a better word, sisterhood rather than their husbands. Okay. All right. Check out the PowerPoints, the other video lectures that I put up. And if you have any questions, as always, student office hours, find me in Zoom. You can always find me in Cranium. You can come to my office on campus, this thing in Quad 222A. And you can email me. Absolutely, you can email me. So please reach out if you need to. Take care.